Hey everyone, today I'm taking a look at Beer and Bread. Now this is a 2-player only multi-use card and resource management game designed by Scott Almes and published by Deep Print Games and Pegasus Spiel. This game takes around 30 to 45 minutes to play on average. Now before I get started on my review of Beer and Bread, I want to give a shout out to the show sponsor and place where I purchased Beer and Bread. This is KIENDA.co.uk, who are my go-to online retailer when it comes to purchasing board games here in the UK. And if you use my link in the show notes or the QR code, then you can get 5% off your first order. Okay, so Beer and Bread is going to look like this once it's set up, where you have the main board here, which is essentially a placeholder for the different components of the game, such as the cards you'll play and the resources that are readily available. So you've got 5 different types of resources. You also have a round tracker here, so you're going to play out over 6 rounds, and alternating, you're going to have 2 kind of phases of the game. So in rounds 1, 3, and 5, you're going to have fruitful seasons, and in rounds 2, 4, and 6, you're going to have what we call dry seasons. And what that essentially means is that there are going to be fewer resources available in those dry seasons, but there are also some other changes too, which we'll touch on. There's going to be a big deck of cards here where you're going to have the 2 types of cards, the beer and the bread, mixed in together randomly. Each player is going to draw 5 cards at random to create their hand of cards, and then the game will begin. So the objective of the game is to utilize these cards as best as possible to basically fulfill these contracts. So you can see here that each of these cards is broken down into 3 parts. The top strip here is essentially your way to gain resources. The middle part here is the resources you need to cash in to get this many points. And the bottom part of the card is kind of an engine building benefits, which you'll use to tuck in to the main board here and give you ongoing rewards as the game progresses. Now the twist on this game is that when it comes to the final scoring, you are going to calculate how many points you've got in the beer category and how many points you've got in the bread category, but only your lowest of the 2 is going to be your final score. So it's a good idea to keep both of those categories as balanced as possible. So the first thing you're going to do in a fruitful round is you're going to seed the board here equal to the numbers here. So you can see here that this particular resource wants 7 on the little farm space. This one wants 8, and so on. And once that's done, you are going to draw your 5 cards. And you're going to have a bit of a draft by selecting one of your cards, choosing which way you want to use it, and then passing the remaining cards in your hand to your opponent, and then your opponent will do the same thing back and forth until you have no cards left. And that'll be the end of the first round of the game. So let's talk about what your 3 choices of actions are. So we've already touched about, we'll basically touch on them, but the first one is to, again, gain resources. So let's just say I wanted to play this card here without any rhyme or reason to gain these 2 particular resources. Now when you gain them, you are going to take them from the board here, and if they run out, you can't have them anymore. So it's quite careful, you've got to be quite careful about the availability of each resource. So in this example, I would gain one of these and also one of these. Now when I take those resources, I'm going to put them on my storage area here. Now this is important because you do have a very strict capacity of only 9 resources to begin with. There are ways to increase your capacity, and that's going to be the end of your turn basically. But in the future, let's say I played another card in this method like so. I am going to have a look at any of the matching symbols that I've played and also get those resources. So in this example, I'll get a water from the supply here, but I would get 2 of these resources and then 2 of these resources as well. So they do start to compound together, but that only happens when they match. So if I wanted to play this a 3rd time, I would not actually get any duplicates because these are 2 fresh symbols that have not been seen in that row yet. Now, another thing to be aware of is that if you take resources from the supply and you do not have the space to store it in your kind of storage area here, then any overspill will be given to your opponent if they have the space to store it. So you've got to be quite careful about what you take and not to kind of give things to your opponent. My second option is to complete one of these contracts. So if I had all the resources listed here, so I've got the water, I've got one of these, and one of these, I'm going to remove them from my storage like so. And then I am going to put them back in the general supply. So they're not going to go back into the fields. And that is going to be essentially a completed contract for endgame scoring. Now, once you've played them, you are going to put them face down on the matching spots here. So you have, again, the beer spot, the brewery, and you also have the bakery for your completed bread cards. But something that's important is that you can only, as a base rule, you can only ever complete one contract at a time. And if that space is complete, then you are not going to be able to complete another one of that type. So if I had another beer contract ready for completing, I'm not going to be able to put it on here until this card has been moved out of the way, and that will link to the next action, which is to play a card as an engine building benefit. So what you're going to do is you're going to have a look at the bottom benefit here. Like, for example, if I wanted to play this one, it will say at the end of the seeding phase, which is when you fill up all the resources, you are going to collect one of these resources. So let's say I wanted to do that because it's going to benefit me in the long term. What I'm going to do, without any prerequisites or any kind of requirements, I'm going to tuck that under the matching spot on the board here to remind me that whenever it comes to this part of the game, I'm also going to get this nice little benefit here. And there are a ton of different things that these cards do, each relating to a different aspect of the game. Like some of them might say, your brewery or bakery might be able to store another card before you wipe them off. Or some of them might give you endgame scoring, such as, for every 2 beer cards that you sold, you gain an extra coin for beer, and so on. And we'll talk about some more of these cards a bit later. But another thing that's important is that when you do tuck a card under your player board, as an engine building benefit, you get to wipe off these 2 slots here, ready for more contracts to be completed. So the fruitful round is going to end once each player has drafted and resolved their 5 cards, and then you'll progress on to the first dry phase. Now, as mentioned earlier, this will mean that there are fewer resources available here. So you can see in this example, the 8 drops all the way down to a 4, making resources a lot harder to get. But it'll also modify the way the game is played, because the dry phases don't get resolved in a draft. You are going to pick up the cards that you've played as resources back into your hand, ready to be used again, and then you're going to draw additional cards to make your hand back up to 5. Now, what this means is that if you wanted to maybe hold on to a card because of the contract on it, you can potentially play it as a resource gatherer, draw it back into your hand in order to play it as a contract later. However, when it comes to the end of a dry phase, any cards that you play as resources will be discarded for good. So you're not going to be able to keep rinsing and repeating for that. You're only going to have 1 round's grace in order to do it. Now, another change made between the fruitful and dry phases of the game is that instead of drafting back and forth, you actually only keep the cards in your hand and play them one by one. So again, you don't have that worry of giving cards away to your opponent. Another change that happens during the dry phases of the game is that 3 cards are going to go into this public display here, meaning that you can swap cards from your hand with ones on public here. And if you do that, you're going to have to resolve this card instantly, but it does mean that you might be giving a card that your opponent wants to them as an option. So you've got to be quite careful of that. And that's essentially how the game is going to progress over the 6 rounds. You're going to add up your score in each category. Again, the lowest one of the 2 is going to be your final score, added any bonus points you'll get by putting cards under this coin slot here. But let's take a look at some more of the engine building benefit cards. So we have some examples of the endgame scoring cards here. This one here where it says if you have at least 2 more resources in your storage than your opponent does at the end of the game, you're going to get an extra 2 coins. This one here, for every 2 beer cards that you sell, you get an extra coin. This one here, you'll get an extra coin for every card that is worth 4 or 5 coins. This one here, when it comes to the cleanup phase, if you remove both your beer and bread in a single movement, you'll get 2 water. This one here, because you may hold an additional bread card in your bakery to stop you having to refresh so frequently. This one here simply gives you more storage, so you don't have to worry about being at capacity so soon. And these ones here will mean that you get resources when it comes to the seeding phase, and you even have ones that will rely on the kind of turning of a phase, where this card says that during the fruitful years, before the first card swap with the other player, you can turn one of the cards in your hand upside down, protecting it from being stolen from the other player. Okay, so let's share some thoughts on beer and bread. So generally speaking, I'm not a huge fan of almost like contract fulfillment games where you're collecting resources in order to complete cards. Now this game does have that, but I do like the way that is merged with a few additional, sometimes minor mechanisms. To start with, the actual choice of how to utilize the cards is an interesting one, especially when it comes to the drafting or the fruitful years, because you do have to bear in mind the risk of giving cards away to your opponent. Because you might think, I don't quite have these resources yet, but if I play them now and get the resources, hopefully the card will make it back to me, and then I'll have the resources in order to cash it in. But you also do have that almost kind of, like one round's grace, that strategic planning of, yes, I'm going to play these cards in front of me to gain resources, and that can really compound if you start matching the symbols. But it does mean that when it comes to the dry phase, you can pick it into your hand, pick it back up into your hand. You could use it again as more resources or for the engine building benefit, but more importantly, you can build towards something. So again, you do have that option of looking ahead and gaining resources in order to build towards a certain card to get those points. And I also love the way that you have to be careful of not gaining too many resources, because again, that overspill is going to go to your opponent, which can just lay the foundation for your opponent to use that against you and complete their own contracts quicker. There is the potential to build some rather nice engines here. If at the start of each round you're getting a bunch of resources and things, that can be really useful, and again, just give you that passive income. I also like the fact that there are limited resources available here, meaning that pressure to get your resource cards down might be amplified because those resources might not be there by the time it gets back to your turn. The game also feels very fast. There's not much downtime at all, and before you know it, those 6 rounds are going to be finished and you are calculating final scoring. So yeah, it definitely doesn't outstay its welcome. I'm considering there are some reasonably good decisions here in terms of how to utilize those cards. Now, my biggest criticism of this game is actually something I tend to enjoy in board games, and that is the scoring system. So this game recycles that KIENDA scoring system where you are competing in several fronts, but only your worst one is your final score. Now, because in this game you are only competing in 2 different fields, the beer and the bread, what it means is that naturally you are going to keep those piles as balanced as possible. So for every beer card you do, you're going to do a bread card. And for me, that felt a bit scripted and it felt a bit on the rails, and it kind of took a lot of choices out of your hand, because sometimes you're thinking, I've got loads of resources here, I'm obviously going to do the one that I've got the lowest pile of. Yes, there are ways to kind of tinker with that with these extra cards, but it didn't make a huge difference. So yeah, it kind of felt a bit diluted, and it felt like it was a bit predetermined and a bit pre-written on what your overall strategy was going to be. I think the production of this game is pretty much perfect. It looks fantastic on the table. Michael Menzel is probably one of my favourite board game artists. He makes the best looking actual boards I've ever seen, and this is another example of that. I actually think it's a really cool idea that these engine building cards slide under the different aspects of the game which they're helping or boosting. So it helps to remind you and not forget which cards you've invested in. The resources are nice. I like the way that they fit on your storage areas. The cards are nicely and cleanly broken down into the 3 different areas to easily digest the information on them. So yeah, I got no criticisms at all about the production. I think it's top notch actually, and it fits into a nice little kind of 2-player sized box there. There's even a little scoring pad, which is kind of not entirely necessary, but it's nice they added it in there. Okay, so let's share some final thoughts on beer and bread. Now, this is a nice game. It's certainly pleasant to play. It flows really nicely. And to be honest, some of the things I like the most about it are some minor touches. I think there's some very clever little design choices here, especially when it comes to gaining the resources and the surplus resources going to your opponent. That's a really interesting touch that adds some, again, more player interaction there. And I do like that degree of planning that you can use cards as resources in the fruitful phases and then pick them back up and then complete them in the dry phases to plan ahead and build towards something. There are some nice engine builder benefits you can contribute to as well. Some of them are more interesting than others, but generally it all works nicely. And it does feel that you have some forward momentum here. And again, that player interaction is a strong part of the game. Giving cards away to your opponent during the drafts and swapping the cards over, being the first to grab the resources. It is all quite harmonious in the way you interact with your opponent. Now, despite me not having much negative to say about this game in general, I know I do feel like the balancing of the beer and the bread cards is kind of overplayed. It's not actually that important. You're obviously going to keep them as balanced as possible. It's a lot more interesting when you're competing over, 3 or 4 or 5 different ways to score points and your lowest one scoring. When it's only 2, you're obviously going to keep them balanced. But again, despite me liking a lot about this game, I think the biggest thing about it is that it does lack a certain X factor. There's no real standout mechanism about it, and it does feel kind of pedestrian, and that you've seen a lot of these things before. Now, it is a strong example of the multi-use card system. I do like resource management games when there is a capacity, so I do like the fact that you can't just hoard a bunch of resources. It keeps it a bit more tighter and a bit more interesting. But yeah, is this going to be one that I'm always going to kind of come back to, considering how many great two-player games out there? I'm not quite sure that is going to be the case with this one. I think it's going to kind of come and go through my collection, but that being said, I certainly don't regret my time with it. I would even recommend it to the right people. But yeah, for me, I think I'd rather play something else. So it's a bit of a near miss for me. Probably put it about a 6.5 out of 10, which is certainly, better than average. But yeah, is it going to keep me coming back? I don't think so. So sadly, I can't overly recommend this one, but I'm not going to discourage you from trying it either if you do like these more simple resource management games with some pretty interesting twists. So that is Beer and Bread.